Hello, my name is Brad Buckhalter. I'm a student in the Texas Tech University graduate program in English. The title of my paper is Making Violence Visible: Extractive Capital and Social Depredation in Helon Habila's Oil on Water. Contemporary ways of living with and thinking about oil, when oil is thought about at all, often occlude the facts around oil's material existence, particularly its physical extraction. But the act of extraction, of drilling thousands of feet beneath the Earth's surface to locate and remove crude oil by force, is an act of violence. And frequently, especially in regions of the world with feeble government oversight, extractive activities result in environmental violence. But oil extraction can lead to other, less legible forms of violence as well. In Oil on Water, Helon Habila takes the reader into the Niger Delta, the largest oil-producing region on the African continent, to expose the hidden violence that often accompanies oil extraction. Initially framed as a detective story, a search for a kidnapped Englishwoman, the novel ultimately reveals itself as about more than the pursuit of a kidnapping victim. Instead, as Habila's narrator follows the trail of the Englishwoman, he experiences and describes how oil extraction has permanently altered the Niger Delta's social and cultural institutions. These forms of social violence are manifested in the damaged, in some cases destroyed, villages the narrator encounters, whether the material village of land and structures or the intangible village of peoples and societies. These despoiled villages aggregate as a metaphor of the collision between forces of global oil capital and local Niger Delta society, a reality invisible to the reader whose existence is always already situated within neoliberal petrodiscourses that laud progress and development while suppressing the facts attending oil's extraction. By focusing the reader's gaze on the novel's trail of despoiled villages, two of which are analyzed in this paper, Oil on Water not only makes legible the hidden violence and expansionist global oil capital inflicts on societies and cultures in the Niger Delta, Habila's damaged villages also reify the ways the quote, modern capitalist world system, end quote, animates and subtends extractive violence in the Delta. In the end, Oil on Water compels the reader to confront the realities of global extractive capitalism operating in the Niger Delta, allowing the reader to see and acknowledge what is often illegible, forgotten, or conveniently ignored in our petro-modernity. The precarity of societies and cultures in global South extraction zones. Oil on Water begins in medias res, with Habila having placed the reader into the Niger Delta in search of Isabel Flood, a kidnapped Englishwoman married to a high-level British petroleum geologist based in Port Harcourt, the Niger Delta's de facto commercial capital. As part of their negotiation strategy, Isabel Flood's captors, insurgents from the Delta, issue a call for journalists to join them in an undisclosed Delta location so the journalists can witness then report in their respective publications on the captives' well-being. The novel's narrator, Rufus, a young Port Harcourt reporter, volunteers to accompany a group of 4 other journalists to meet the kidnappers on what he expects to be a quick day trip. Instead, Rufus and his colleague Zach spend 2 weeks in the Niger Delta on the trail of the insurgents and their victim. The search for Isabel Flood is Habila's pretense for inserting Rufus and Zach into the Delta, where they come face to face with the violence global oil inflicts on the social and cultural environments of the extraction zone. Rufus and Zach make their way into the Delta in a boat piloted by a Delta inhabitant called simply the Old Man. There they discover 2 deserted villages. Rufus's description of the first village conveys the material reality of a society broken by its encounter with oil. Attesting to the power of oil to wipe the space of the Delta clean of its inhabitants, quote, the village looked as if a deadly epidemic had swept through it, end quote. And symbolic of oil's power, a, quote, square concrete platform dominated the village like some sacrificial altar, end quote, elevating oil to the sacral, a perverse deity that exacts sacrifice by dispossessing the villagers of their resources, lands, and culture. Tellingly, the altar/platform bears a sign indicating a well was completed at that spot, a direct marker of Global Oil's acts of dispossessive accumulation, of its taking the light, sweet crude that lies beneath the village surface. Although the presence of the derelict oilfield equipment correlates with the vacant state of the village, the specific reason for the village's abandonment is not apparent to Rufus. When asked, the old man explains the villagers, quote, left because of too much fighting, end quote, a reference to the insurgency arising out of Global Oil's activities in the Niger Delta that began in 1958, 2 years before Nigeria gained independence from British rule. Since then, Shell and other global oil companies operating in the Delta have faced few environmental or operational constraints. As a result, the Niger Delta has become one of the most polluted places on the planet. It was these environmentally and socially reckless operations, combined with grossly inequitable dispossessive accumulation of Niger Delta oil, that spurred Delta inhabitants in the early 1990s to stage protests against the activities of global oil capital, Shell in particular. Over time, these initially peaceful protests turned violent, with hostility escalating in frequency and intensity. Eventually, armed insurgent groups came to patrol the Delta, engaging in acts of sabotage against the oil companies and in firefights with the government soldiers who pursued them. The complex history of this long-running armed conflict underlies Oil and Water's narrative arc, particularly as it relates to what Rob Nixon would describe as the slow violence of social and cultural destruction the novel highlights and critiques. After exploring the deserted village in the novel's opening pages, Rufus, Zach, and the old man press on, stopping to spend the night at the old man's village, located on wooden platforms built over the river's mudflats. There, Rufus meets the village chief, Ibiram, who tells how his people were displaced by global oil. Chief Ibiram's story is a lapsarian tale of expulsion from a, quote, paradise, end quote, where the villagers had once farmed, hunted, fished, and raised their children among extended family. Oil capital, however, made its way to that Edenic setting, drilling wells in neighboring villages and erecting natural gas flares. The gas flame, quote, long and coiled like a snake, whispering, winking, hissing, end quote, promising wealth to those who sold their land to the oil companies. As if the lure of the serpentine gas flare were not enough, oil company representatives conspired with politicians and government officials to convince the villagers to sell their lands to the company. Malabo, then village chief, declined, but the oil companies and the state would not be denied. The state accused Chief Malabo of cooperating with insurgents and imprisoned him, where he died soon afterward. The week after Chief Malabo's death, the oil companies moved in, quote, with a whole army, waving guns and looking like they meant business. They had a contract, they said. Chief Malabo had signed it in prison before he died, selling them all of his family land, and that was where they'd start drilling, end quote. Although most of the villagers ultimately chose to sell to the oil company, 10 families, including Chief Ibiram's, would not. They left the village, refusing the oil money. Since then, they had become wanderers in the Delta, passing from one temporary space of refuge to another. By representing the deserted village in the novel's opening pages, and by writing Chief Ibiram's story of the destructive power of global oil capital supported by the authority of the state, Habila makes visible the social and cultural depredation occurring out of sight in the Niger Delta. These forms of petroviolence are indicia of what Amitav Ghosh named in his influential review of Abdul Rahman Munif's novels Cities of Salt and The Trench as the oil encounter. In that instance, incursion by American oil capital into the Arab world, the subsequent displacement of indigenous peoples, and the sordid history that ensued. Oil on Water, as part of the growing lineage of petrofiction arising out of the Niger Delta, depicts that region's oil encounter. The villages Rufus and Zach visit during their travels show the incursion of global oil into the Niger Delta societies and cultures, and highlight practices resulting in the displacement of indigenous peoples. The first village Rufus encounters had been abandoned due to the protracted and destructive insurgency spurred by the equally destructive operations of global oil. While the derelict oil field equipment left behind in the first village speaks of past extractive activities, Chief Ibaram's story brings extractive practices into full view in the novel's present, telling how global oil and the state combine to force a choice between the sale of ancestral lands or their abandonment. The story of Chief Ibaram's people thus depicts the injustices suffered by indigenous societies in the Niger Delta, going to the heart of Habila's project of making legible the forms of social and cultural violence hidden in the extraction zone. And by telling how the Nigerian state imprisoned Chief Malabo and authorized force to execute his, quote, contract, end quote. Chief Ibaram's story further shows the Nigerian state placing its power at the disposal of oil capital. Doing the work of petrofiction, Oil on Water thus makes legible the Niger Delta oil encounter and the violence extractive capitalism has inflicted and continues to inflict on the social and cultural environments of the Delta. The story of the expanding global oil capital that tears apart Chief Ibaram's village not only exposes how global oil destroys Niger Delta society and culture, it also brings to light the conjunction of global capital and state neoliberalism that has fueled global oil's continued incursions into the Delta region. As Wendy Brown has explained, neoliberalism and its trends toward aggressive deregulation and privatization of the public commons has been characterized as an economic policy, a modality of governance, and an order of reason that, as a global phenomenon, is, quote, inconstant, differentiated, unsystematic, impure, end quote. In fact, according to David Harvey, when neoliberalism's claimed touchstones of deregulation and privatization fail to generate sufficient profit, they are, quote, either abandoned or become so twisted as to be unrecognizable, end quote. In other words, neoliberalism in general, and as actualized in Nigeria in particular, tends to assume unlikely forms in its pursuit of continued wealth generation for the elite. Habila's representation of the oil encounter in the Niger Delta shows how the neoliberal wealth accumulation strategies of global oil capital and the Nigerian state elite have affected Delta societies and cultures. A neoliberal actor in the global economy attuned to the commodification of everything that is a hallmark of neoliberalism, the oil company conceives of the oil beneath Chief Ibaram's village as strictly a monetizable commodity. The rules of neoliberalism require that the villagers share this understanding, behaving as would any rational homo economicus by promptly selling their lands for profit. Chief Malabo's demurral, however, prompts the oil company to summon state intervention to effectuate its intent. The state obliges, ultimately authorizing deadly force, quote, a whole army waving guns, end quote, to help execute Chief Malabo's alleged land sale contract. Habila's critique of the strange brew of neoliberalism and oil economics in the Niger Delta raises troubling questions about a state that would sacrifice an entire region's social and cultural networks for oil revenue. This conjoining of oil capital and state power, however, marks but the most recent iteration of Nigerian policies that long ago resulted in the nationalization of Niger Delta oil reserves. By the mid-1980s, however, due to ballooning national debt and pressured by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Nigeria adopted a cluster of neoliberal structural adjustment programs putatively intended to spur domestic economic growth. Yet even then, the Nigerian state clung to its sovereignty over Niger Delta oil. With such moves, the state's role in the social welfare of its people, quote, became whittled away by a global campaign of neoliberalism, end quote. Vijay Prashad has argued Nigeria actually was not forced to attempt to adopt a neoliberal agenda at all, but instead, quote, came to the idea willingly, end quote, allowing the IMF to take the blame for policies the state tacitly supported. In fact, according to Prashad, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo gladly enforced neoliberal policies, using the power of the state to crush any dissent, including protests against Shell in the Niger Delta. With Chief Ibaram's story, Habila shows just such state violence executed in support of neoliberal policies and capitalist expansion. The story of Chief Ibaram's village concretizes the neoliberal expansion that is inextricable from the story of the Niger Delta extraction zone. Because the abstraction that is neoliberalism is difficult to approach directly, Habila critiques its indicia, shining a light on its consequences, including the social and cultural destruction caused by global oil's operations in the Delta. In doing so, he implicitly acknowledges what Warwick Research Collective has described as the key to decoding world literature, that capitalism acts as, quote, the substrate of world literature, end quote, underpinning its existence, and that the uneven modernity following in the wake of capitalism's global expansion not only provides world literature with its subject matter, but also defines its formal characteristics. One can see this at work in the novel's text. Whether clashes between insurgents and military, or the less obvious harm of social and cultural destruction, the normalized violence bred by a violent capitalism is both the novel's foundational animating element as well as its subject matter. Additionally, the novel's narrative, with multiple flashbacks and chronological and spatial leaps, has been described as, quote, complex and disorienting, end quote, and, quote, extremely nonlinear, resembling more of a spiral than a chronological timeline, end quote. The spiraling, disorienting text arguably serves as a formal approximation of the nonlinear, disorienting neoliberalism manifested in Nigerian oil economics, as it bends and shapes itself into forms most likely to generate wealth for global oil and the Nigerian state elite. By showing global oil's depredation of the villages of the Niger Delta, Habila lays bare what often goes either unseen or ignored in our petro-modernity: how global oil companies, supported by neoliberal state policies, have forever altered rural and indigenous social and cultural systems. In making visible these forms of violence, Habila discharges a principal mandate of petrofiction, that of making legible the destruction that is the consequence of our petrocultures, and shines a light on the, quote, modern capitalist world system, end quote, that spawns such violence. Ultimately, Oil on Water reminds us not only that we live in a world in which global oil capital routinely inflicts violence on the societies and cultures of the extraction zone, but that our understanding of the operations of global oil is mediated and occluded by discourses that are in turn shaped by forces of capitalism, economic policy, and state power. By making legible the illegible capitalist substrate and the often invisible but violent consequences of globalized extractivism, Oil on Water makes space for reconceptualizing the discourses around not only oil, but also capitalism, globalization, and environmental justice, all of which collide in the hidden spaces of the Niger Delta.